Okay. All right, we're going to start the interview, and the first thing I'd like you to tell us is just your name, where you were born. Start out that way.
My name is Heller, Max Heller. I was born in Vienna, Austria, and I now live in Greenville, South Carolina.
Okay, and you were born when?
I was born in 1919.
Okay. Can you tell us a little about your childhood in Vienna, what your family life was like?
Well, I grew up in a very wonderful, loving, warm family. I have a sister and my mother and father. I would say we were middle income. My father was in business. I grew up in a very Orthodox Jewish home. My parents observed the Sabbath. They would not work on the Sabbath. They would not even touch money on the Sabbath. They would not ride on the Sabbath, and we kept the dietary laws. And I would say that we grew up a very happy home life. But I also have to tell you that there was a lot of anti-Semitism even when I was going to grammar school. The big difference was that the government did not sponsor that kind of anti-Semitism. But the fact remains that it was there. And I had to learn to fight my way through school or on the streets or in the park. And my parents made sure that I learned something about my Judaism so that I could respond to some of these ridiculous accusations that were made. And I've always felt that it was important to know who you are, where you come from. And it's not enough to say, well, I'm proud to be a Jew, or I'm proud to be a Christian, or whatever you say. You've got to know why. So I would say that I was taught, I had a Hebrew teacher who gave me a good education, who taught me our history, and I led what we considered a normal life. We grew up with anti-Semitism. That was part of our life. And unfortunately, of course, what happened later on was totally different, because it became so brutal and unbelievable to the average person would just not believe it.
Yeah. If we can just backtrack a bit, you grew up did you grow up in a Jewish neighborhood in Vienna, largely?
Well, I would say that most of the people, yes. In Vienna, there were about 200,000 Jews, which is about 10% of the population. And I would not say that it was really a Jewish district, because the apartment house where I lived, we had probably more Christians than Jews. But generally speaking, yes, there were a good many Jews that lived there. Mm-hmm. I went to a public grammar school for 4 years, and then I went to a private high school for 4 years. That's all that was required. I finished school when I was 18.
Was that the gymnasium?
The gymnasium, yes, yeah.
And was it the anti-Semitism that you personally encountered? Was it more in the context of school, or was it just was it in the press? Was it a general?
It was everywhere.
It was everywhere.
It was everywhere. It disturbs me even today when I see some caricatures of people where they show a Jew with his big nose and big eyes and black hair, because that's what they did then already in Vienna. And that's what Hitler did, even more so. As ugly as you could make somebody, that's what a Jew looked like. But let me say this, that despite all of that, our life was a happy life, because there was a lot of strength within our own family, and for that matter, within the Jewish community. And I had many friends that were not Jewish. There was no separation as far as that's concerned.
Mm-hmm. As you were a teenager, when Hitler became chancellor, when were you aware very early on about Hitler?
In 1933, when Hitler came to power, we frankly could not believe some of the stories we heard, because they were unimaginable. And people would say to us, Hitler is going to confiscate a business because you are Jewish, or you can no longer work in an establishment because you are Jewish, or or intermarriages were not allowed, and things. It was so hard for us to believe, just like it was hard for the whole world to believe it. And yet we felt like the rest of the world was not going to let too much happen. I mean, how could the world stand by? Just before Hitler marched into Austria, the Nazi Party had been established as a party of violence. In fact, they killed a chancellor years before they even came to power, and the battles in the streets were fierce. And there were many political parties in Vienna at that time. And finally, the Nazi Party was driven underground. And there were many political prisoners that had been taken by the leading party, which were the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. So just before Hitler came, there was a lot of turmoil already. And when Hitler finally marched in 1938, there was to be a vote whether the Austrians wished to become part of Germany. And we had no way of knowing which way it would go, but the propaganda was tremendous, and there was the streets were full of political slogans painted on. And the reason I mention this to you, and the windows and the doors on the homes and apartment houses, the reason I mention this to you is because after Hitler did march in, the Jews were required to clean the streets, and they scrubbed the streets. And not only that, I know I'm getting ahead of my story, but I was forced by a schoolmate of mine, who I thought was my best friend, to get down on my knees and scrub the streets. And not only scrub the streets, but clean out the gutters. And I don't have to tell you what you find in those gutters. That's just one of those experiences. But let me get back to when Hitler did take over. First of all, I have to say that the population was jubilant. Jubilant. I mean, they were dancing in the streets.
So this is actually on the day of the Anschluss.
Oh, it was just... And it was so well organized, you would just not believe how well organized the Nazis were. The day after Hitler marched in, our bank account was already confiscated. Because everybody had an ID, and the identification card said whether you were Jewish or not. And that's one reason why I fear we should never come to that in our country you have to carry an ID card. I mean, they knew exactly who was who. And so when we want to get our money out of the bank, we were told, in no uncertain terms, you are Jewish and your account is closed. The Monday after Hitler marched in, for instance, I went to work. I had already been working at that time. And on the way to work, I lived near a park. The street, the park benches were already marked, no Jews allowed. When I came to work on that following Monday, a former employee of that company came in with Hitler, with people with uniforms, in Hitler uniforms, and took over the business and fired every Jewish person except 3 of us. I remained. People that I worked with in that company. I started there as an apprentice, that I thought were my friends. They came into work on Monday in Nazi uniforms. So I'm saying all this so that people can understand really what it was like. What did it look like? We could not believe that this would last. We could not believe that the world would stand by and let this happen, that you can confiscate somebody's apartment. People were thrown out of their apartment. Their business was taken away. Neighbor turned against neighbor. And yet the world was silent. I have always said that the world does not hear tears. Tears are silent. The world hears cannons and guns, but silent tears they do not hear.
Yet even after the Anschluss, you still, or you and your family, you were still convinced that somehow or other the outside world was not going to allow it. even though it already seemed to be a fait accompli in some ways.
Right.
When did,
And yet, I must say, excuse me for interrupting you.
Sure.
The day after, in fact, the day it happened, that night, it was on a Friday night, and we went home and we lit the candles, the Sabbath candles, and we had our regular Sabbath meal as if nothing had happened, except that there were tears there, and we wondered, where do we go from here? I said then, there's only one place for us, and that's America. And if I tell you the story how I came here, which is a miracle in itself. So as far as I'm concerned and my family were concerned, America was the place for us to be, because I felt that Europe has had it. But I'll let you.
Sure.
I'll let you ask me
Sure.
what.
Sure. Well, following along those lines, and did you see the huge lines in front of embassies and consulates in Vienna?
It's also interesting. You should know that the Nazis cleaned out all the grocery stores and moved, because they in Austria evidently there was more food available than in Germany there was. What had happened with me was that the year before Hitler came in 1937, I met my wife. I fell in love with her the day I met her. I know she's going to watch this tape, so I want her to hear that. She knows it. But I also met a group of American girls in a restaurant, obviously with a chaperone. And there was one there that I found very attractive, and I was with a boyfriend of mine in that restaurant, and they had dancing, and I said, oh, God, I'd love to meet this girl. And I went up and I asked her to dance with me. I couldn't speak English, and she couldn't speak German, but the chaperone spoke German, and she gave permission for me to dance with her. And we did dance until the place closed, and then I asked permission, could I meet her the next day and take her for a walk and show her Vienna, and the chaperone agreed. And I went out and I bought a little dictionary, and I picked up this young lady, and we walked for about 2 hours, and we made conversation through that dictionary. When I left, I said, please give me your name and address, and I will write to you as soon as I learn how to speak English. I had taken Latin in school, by the way. And I kept that address, and that was in August of 1937. The day Hitler marched in, I had it in my back pocket, in my wallet. I said to my parents, you remember this girl I met from America? I'm going to write to her. And her name was Mary Mills, and she lived on Mills Avenue, Greenville, South Carolina. And I wrote to her, and I said in the letter, and I have a copy of it somewhere, I could not say too much because you were afraid of the censorship. But I said, I must get out of here. Please help me. I hope you remember me. And I said, I will never be a burden to you. And when I said that to people, that I had written this girl I met only one time, and they said, she'll never remember. Well, a miracle occurred. And weeks afterwards, I did receive a letter from her saying, I have not forgotten you. I've gone to see somebody here in Greenville, a Jewish man. And by the way, Mary Mills was not Jewish, and there's a wonderful lesson there. Because the man who did send me the letter, his name was Shepard Salzman, said in his letter, Mary Mills came to see me today. How can I, a Jew, not help you when she, a Christian, wants to help? I mean, to me, that is true religion, Judo-Christian, whatever you might be. And this is how I came. He sent the papers for me. And things got very rough in Vienna. I mean, people were...
Still 38 now?
That was 1938. This was March of 1938. Yeah. And, of course, April and so on. Yeah. And people were taken into concentration. People disappeared. Simply disappeared. A neighbor would come in who had liked your apartment for years and say, I want this apartment. And things like that happened.
Had you heard, Dachau was in operation for about 5 years. Had you heard about Dachau, or was any of that, did any of that filter to Vienna?
No.
you didn't know, so
No.
that wasn't
No.
reported in the general
No.
press or anything.
No.
When did you first hear about camps? When did that
Just
news?
as I would say, probably in June. It was several months after.
Mm-hmm.
And some of our friends were actually taken away, and then we were told they were sent to camps. We didn't know the names. The cruelty was unbelievable. We had a friend, my parents had a friend, who was taken away in a truck. His family was told to say goodbye to him, and they took him. He didn't know where he was blindfolded, but they took him. Obviously, it was a basement, and where they took the blindfold off, and they said, "Say your last prayers." In Hebrew, that's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, our Lord, our God is one. Because we're going out, you're going to be killed. And he heard the shooting, and and they did it in alphabetical order. And then his name was called. They took him out in the courtyard. They shot in the air. They undressed him, and they kicked him out. And that man just about lost his mind. I mean, those are the kind of things that have things. My sister had a close call. So just to make this a little bit shorter, fortunately, this man did send the papers. He was willing to include my sister in the affidavit, and so both of us were able to come to the United States. Our parents were left behind, and my parents were a Polish quota. In those days, there was a quota. I was an Austrian quota because I was born in Austria.
So your family had come from Poland
My
to
family
Vienna.
was originally born in Poland, yes. One thing I have to say that we need to realize how times have changed. Today, God forbid, if a Holocaust were to happen again, or let's assume, let's just go back to what happened in Cuba. We thought nothing of opening up our doors and let in 200,000 Cubans. When there was a big problem in violence in Hungary, for instance, and the Russians were attacking Hungarian citizens, we opened the doors. The world opened the doors. What happened when it happened in Germany and in Austria? The quotas were still in existence. I mean, thank God for America. America at least allowed some people to come in. But you couldn't go in anywhere else. There was no place to go. So is there a lesson? We have to learn a lesson from all of this. We must never let this happen again. Well,
Just backtracking, just once again.
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's perfectly all right. Do you remember Kristallnacht? Where?
No, I was gone already.
Oh, you were gone by then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the papers came through then in the summer of that.
My papers came through at the end of July.
The end of July.
1938, and I came to America the first week in August. I was allowed $8. 20 shillings, which was the equivalent to $8.
What ship did you? What
It came on a French boat
out of
the Ile-de-France, out of Le Havre.
Oh, on the Ile-de-France.
Yeah, yeah.
What was it? What do you remember much about that sailing? What was it like?
It was wonderful, the sailing.
Had you been abroad? I mean,
no, I had never. I'd never been on a ship. There was a great deal of sadness when I said goodbye to my parents. I'll never forget the scene, because we were leaving by train, and we were standing. My parents were standing on the platform, and I was already in the car, and we were holding hands. The window was open, and we held hands as long as we could. And the train started moving, and my parents ran with us holding hands, and then they had to let go. And what I remember more than anything else is, looking back, they were smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, these are tragedies that you have to live through to understand. Humans became so inhuman and caused that kind of tragedy as happened with us. But we were lucky. I mean, thank God we were able to get out.
Yeah. So you and your sister, you got on the ship, and
we got on the ship with $8, and because I'm a big tipper, By the time I came to New York, I had $1.60 left.
Which even then couldn't have got you very
No.
far.
No.
What were your first impressions of you and your sister? What did you feel when you were coming into New York Harbor? What?
Well, of course, we saw the statue.
Yeah.
I got up 5 o'clock in the morning. I wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. We had read about it. It was wonderful. In fact, I wrote a little poem about it years later. It was unbelievable in a way, because what happens to you after you live under the kind of cruelty and police control, because don't forget, the government sponsored the anti-Semitism. The government sponsored the violence. The government allowed it. They turned their back. So you live there a few months, you change. You change. I often think that we became like cows knowing we would go to be slaughtered. I mean, you become a different person. My first impression was, and this is interesting, because when I got off the boat, I saw police officers, and I saw how friendly they were with people. And the contrast between the police officer in Vienna, and there was that fear that you had of a uniform, and here this friendliness, that was the first sign of freedom. That was the first thing that I remember. And it's something, it's a lesson. And I hope it always stays that way, that our people, the police officers, are here to protect us, to help us, to be our friends. Well, anyhow, I had a job in Greenville, South Carolina, and I was able to go there. We found an aunt, by the way, of my mother's sister, and they gave me the money to come to Greenville.
Where did
and a sandwich.
Money and a sandwich. Where did your aunt live?
In Newark, New Jersey.
In Newark.
Yeah. Yeah, they had been there for 50 years or so. They came, well, not 50, but maybe 35, 40 years.
Did they put you on the train then?
They put me on the train, and I smoked in those days, and gave me a pack of cigarettes, a sandwich, and I came to Greenville. I still had that $1.60 in my pocket.
What were your first impressions then of South Carolina?
Well, South Carolina was so different. It looked great because it was freedom. I would have slept on the streets, and I would have gladly scrubbed floors. It was a feeling, it's hard to explain, because it was the first time away from home. The language, I could not, although I had a friend who could speak English, and for a few weeks before I left, I began to learn some words, so I could say hello, goodbye, and thank you, and those kind of things. I was picked up on the train by Mary Mills, who had everybody thought there was a romantic relationship. There wasn't. It was a wonderful relationship between two human beings. But she was engaged when she picked me up at the station, and also the man who brought me here picked me up at the station, and an hour after I got here, I started to work.
An hour?
Right.
Were you still with your sister? Did you?
No, my sister came. My sister stayed in Newark until I could make sure she could get a job in Greenville.
And so she did follow eventually.
Ultimately she came.
Okay, so an hour later you were working.
I went to work.
Were you working at the trade that you were apprenticed to back in Vienna? Was it something different?
I worked in a shirt factory. The man who brought me over here owned a shirt factory, and I started off in the shipping department because that was the first floor. It was near his office, and he wanted to keep an eye on me. My first job was sweeping floors, which was my first job in Vienna as an apprentice. So by that time I already knew how to sweep floors. The people were absolutely wonderful. Everybody, I was sort of an oddity. The newspaper had written some stories and so on. I have to tell you one other thing that's, I think, very touching, but also tells you how my own feeling. The day after I came to Greenville, and I stayed with a family, I had somebody called me from the front office and said, there's a Judge Plyler here to see you. And the first thing that came to my mind, my God, they're going to send me back. I cannot tell you the fear I had. Well, it turned out that this tall, handsome, gray-haired man, Judge Plyler, came to say, welcome to Greenville. We're happy you're here. I will be president of Furman University this fall, and I would love for you to come and participate in any courses and meet the students. I don't think people realize what that visit meant to me. And there's a lesson in that too, you know, a kind word, a warm welcome. It changes your whole life. It makes a big difference. Well, anyhow, I started working in the shirt factory, and I made $10 a week the first week I was there. You worked 7 days a week, and you worked as long as you had to. I mean, you come to work at 8, and you leave whenever the work is done, and I was grateful for that. I saved $3 the first week, because I paid $7 room and board. So, and life has been good to me. My sister came afterwards. Fortunately, my parents were able to come later. That was another miracle.
Oh, tell us about that, if you don't mind. I was going to ask, were you in communication with your parents all this time?
Yes, we wrote, and of course we sent telegrams.
Yeah. So you could still, I mean, you could still write.
Yes.
The mail wasn't intercepted.
No, the mail was not intercepted, but the mail was censored. But you were very careful what you wrote.
Yeah.
I came with my clothes on my back. I mean, that's what I had. And I must say this, that you learn quickly that what matters is not what's on you. What matters is what's in you. Because what I brought with me, in me, was the thing that sustained me here. It wasn't whether I had 10 suits or 1 suit. That wasn't it. You learn from those experiences. My parents, which were Polish Quarter, my mother took me to the American consulate to get my papers, and you had to stand in line for 24 hours a day. We stood in line in front of all kinds of government offices. We don't have time to all the minor miracles to tell you, but there was a lady sitting there that was going to examine my papers to make sure, and I had to have a health exam, and I had to have papers that showed that I was morally okay, that I had not committed any crime. She had a very wonderful face, and I immediately liked her. And when she examined my papers, she looked up and she said, "Is this your mother?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Are they coming with you?" And but I don't know what made me say it. I says, "They cannot come now. They have to wait until their affairs are straightened out." And this woman gets up and she takes my papers in a file, in a folder, and puts it in a file. That's all I know. Several months later, when my parents wired me that they were coming, and when they came here, I didn't have the money to go and meet them at the boat, but we did telephone, and I said, "How did you come here?" They had a call from the American consulate. This woman had put my papers into a preferred file because my sister and I were minors, and gave my parents a preferred quota because we had to follow us. And that's, you know, you got to have luck with all. I've learned to believe in miracles, but I don't depend on them. You know. Well, anyhow,
did they come to Greenville?
Ultimately,
they did.
The man who brought me here and gave my sister a job, gave my father a job. My mother was ill at the time. In fact, my father really could not work for long. It took a toll on them that was far greater than on me. My father was 50. So he didn't work for very long. But he gave us, this man who brought me here, gave me a wonderful opportunity, and I made progress in my work. Ironically, when my father came here, he came to work in the shipping department, and I became his boss, which he accepted. Those things became relatively unimportant.
Yeah. Now, let's just go back, and you mentioned meeting your future wife.
Yes.
And tell us how she came, and where you in fact were married, and what did it happen
Well,
to you
I
in
met
this country?
Trudy. My wife's name is Trudy. I met her in 1937. The day I met her, I told her I would marry her. I was 17 already. I kept my word. She could not get out when I did. We did stay in touch through the mail over the years. She knew where I was. And she ought to tell you her own story. She ultimately came to America with her mother. Her father was not able to come at that particular time. He was put in a camp. And then we were married in Greenville, South Carolina. She came to Greenville, and we were married in 1942. So we've been married 49 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have a wonderful family. Mm-hmm. I have 3 children, 10 grandchildren.
Are they all in Greenville, or are they scattered around?
No, they're scattered, as life is.
Mm-hmm. Before I ask you what your life was like after the war, later on in Greenville, I'd just like to know, what did you find that once your English got better and you were able to to speak English and understand English, how much curiosity or how much interest or how much knowledge did you find of the people that you worked with and lived with of what was going on in Europe?
Not much.
Not much.
In fact, the newspapers would write very small articles. It was not headlines, very little. I did, once I was able to speak some English, and it didn't take that long because you learn quickly if you have to.
The immersion method.
Yeah. I made a number of talks in churches and at the YMCA and YWCA and so on. I'll never forget one man at a church when I spoke about what freedom means to me and the difference, freedom here and freedom, the lack of freedom in Austria. This man, during the question and answer period, got up and says, "It's not as free as you think it is here." And I said to him, the fact that you can get up and say this without fear of being put in jail proves to me that there's freedom. And you have to understand what it was like. No, people did not.
Was that frustrating for you?
People did not, they could not.
Yeah.
Could not understand how the cruelty of what was happening.
Yeah. Was that frustrating, the fact that people did not seem to? Did you interpret it as lack of comprehension or lack of interest or
not
both?
Lack of interest?
Lack of interest.
Really, the media did not report it. We didn't have television, and not even everybody had a radio. You didn't have car radios as many as you have today, so communication was totally different. And then the other thing, too, in 1938, and things were still pretty tough in this country. There was still a lot of unemployment, and I don't think people that it wasn't a priority to think about what's happening somewhere else.
Did you find, once you arrived, did you find any evidence of anti-Semitism?
Very little. Very little. I had one big disappointment, which shocked me. When my wife and I were engaged, we went to look for apartments. And we found one apartment we liked very much. And I waited weeks and weeks to hear. And finally, the real estate agent said to me, he says, "Max, I don't know how to tell you this. It breaks my heart. But the owner of this apartment building does not want to have any Jews living there." By contrast, what happened after that, Trudy and I went looking for another apartment and met this wonderful lady that showed us an apartment within her house. And I said, "You know, we are Jewish." And she said, "That's wonderful. Why not? I'd love to have you." And she wanted $60 a month rent, and I said, gee, we simply can't afford to pay that much. And she said to me, she says, I like you too. You're a nice couple. I will give it to you for less. And I said, no, I don't want to bargain. It's worth that much. I simply can't afford it. So here was a good deed that offset this bad experience I had with the other people. Yeah. So it's, you know, I live on the good memories, because if you live on the bad memories, you can't survive. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, there was some, but it was, you can't compare that to, it certainly wasn't, there's nothing organized about it.
Yeah. How did you feel? Do you remember how you felt when I assume you followed the war news with great interest? And do you remember the end of the war and how you felt when the war was actually over?
Oh yes, yeah. Well,
were there big celebrations in Greenville? I suppose
yes,
like everywhere else.
It was tremendous.
Yeah.
Tremendous. Let me say this about the United States. If it had not been for America, Hitler may have been the one who survived in Europe. It was the American population. It was the American leadership. It was the American genius, and more than anything else, people willing to bleed, to give of their lives and blood, to go over there and fight a war that was thousands of miles away. You know, in those days, you couldn't jet to Europe in 6 hours. It was even more removed in our own mind, because it took a week by boat or so. And here is this great country of ours willing to do this. And that's not the first time it had happened before.
How quickly
I get very offended when America is criticized unjustly. I'm not saying that we can't express ourselves, but let's just remember what this country did. Let's remember it was the American soldier who liberated the camps. And it was American money that helped to rebuild Europe. Oh my God, what a people we are.
When do you remember, and this might be a hard thing for you to remember exactly, but I'm curious, when did you remember feeling American?
When I started dreaming in English and counting.
Really?
It's an interesting question, but it's the truth.
When did that happen?
I was here just a few months. Really? I loved it from the moment I came here. I mean, I used to, when I was a youngster in Vienna, I used to go to all these American movies. Yeah. And Gary Cooper, what is it, Mr. Dietz goes to Washington, something like that. I would walk out of the movie and I would imitate, and I couldn't speak English, of course, but I would make it sound like I speak English. I was in love with America and Americans. So this was, it wasn't hard for me.
It wasn't hard.
At all. No.
So after the war ended, if you could just tell us a bit about your life and then your public life.
Well,
later on.
We were married in 1942, and after the war ended, I had worked for this man. It was a shirt factory for 7 years, and I had made. Well, I shouldn't say I had made. I should say that he gave me a number of wonderful opportunities. And in fact, I became general manager of that company and a vice president. But I had always been ambitious about going in business for myself. And I had told him that the day I came. I said, I'll never leave you. But there's one thing I want to do. Remember, I was already 18. I said, one day I would like to go in business for myself. And anyhow, I did. We had saved up some money. My wife and I, we were both working. And we saved enough money where I found a man who became a partner with me, and I went into business, a shirt business. Not in Greenville because I didn't want to compete, but in a small town called Williamston. And I found wonderful people there. And I did well in that business. It started in 1946, and then ultimately my partner and I split, and I started another company in Greenville, also in the shirt business, making children's wear. And during that time, I already became very much involved in the community. I felt that I wanted to do something. And my first involvement was with, of all people, the Christian women had an organization that concerned itself about youthful offenders, first and youthful offenders. That was my first involvement in the community, and I was active in that. And so I always became active. I sold my business in 1962, and that was a philosophical decision. I had seen too many people get hung up on money. And Trudy, my wife, was wonderful about that when I said to her, I think I want to sell the business and devote my life to the public. And there was no question that that was her decision as well as mine. So I became even more interested in public life, and I was asked to run for mayor, and I said, no, I'm going to start on the bottom. I'll run for city council. And I did, and I served 2 years for city council, and I became mayor in 1971, and I served for 8 years. That was a wonderful experience. I mean, that was really, one day I'm going to write a book about that. And then in 1979, when Governor Riley took office, he asked me to chair the State Development Board, and I became chairman of that, and I served for over 4 years. And this has been my life. It's been a wonderful life. The community has responded. I feel we still have a lot to do. Today especially, I think the needs of people are greater than ever. And if you were to ask me what is it that bothers you today, what bothers me today is that unfortunately, socially our lives have changed. So our society has changed. It's almost tearing itself apart. The family as a unit has changed. Children have changed. Our morals have changed. I think we need to pull together again. And the only way that can be done is not by government. I mean, that's a sheer nonsense. Sheer nonsense. It's only by people that need to wake up and say, we've got to really understand what is the importance of life. It's not this, you know, the last 10, 15 years it has been the desire to make money. That's been such a priority, and look what it has brought us. I mean, the scandals, not only on Wall Street, but even look what happened in Columbia, South Carolina. Look what's happening in other states, in Washington, for that matter. So what I would say today has to be a call back to the basics. What's in you, not what's on you. That we are all human beings, that we really need to help each other, because where are we going? I didn't mean to, to preach. I think people need to become more involved to help those who cannot help themselves and give a hand to people instead of a handout. Because that's the only way our society can improve. And it needs some improving at the moment. There's just no question about it.
In your sort of almost 50, over 50 years now in South Carolina.
53 years.
53 years. You've seen obviously great changes in this state.
Yes.
Have most of them been positive, do you think?
Oh, yes. No question about it. Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful. I mean, just think about, I worked in a plant. When I first started, I was making $10 a week. Had I been black, I probably would have made $7 a week. When I first saw a water cooler that had a sign that said colored, I thought the water was going to be pink. No, I'm serious.
Really?
Of course it's changed.
Yeah.
It's wonderful, the change. And what is so wonderful is that the change took place without any violence, and that so many people were relieved. I'm not speaking only about those that were discriminated against. But I do know, for instance, when I became mayor, we integrated all commissions. And the people that were on those commissions, the white community said, thank God we are doing this. And it was a pleasure to see a bricklayer next to a banker, both working for the good of Greenville. So our society, without a doubt, has made tremendous. I'm very proud of the progress that's been made. Sure, there's still spots here and there. You know, you'll find that. But take as a whole, South Carolina can be very proud.
I'd just like to ask you something following up on your shock about segregation when you discovered it. Do you think that, you know, there's been so much lately with the antagonism between blacks and Jews?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there is some, I'm not going to say a lesson that can be learned, or some bond or some way that a rapprochement can take place between the black and Jewish communities? Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I think we need to look for positive leadership in both. And we must talk. It is tragic, and it is really tragic that there should be those kind of problems. But look what happens. Look at some of the leadership that has created that it's almost like somebody wants to put oil on the fire instead of trying to dampen it, instead of trying to cool it. So it's a question of leadership, and it's a question of communication. And people must learn not to listen to lies. I mean, people have to ask questions. I saw in the paper not long ago, there's a professor who made a black, New York City, I think, I've forgotten the name. Jeffries, who made a statement that AIDS is chemically produced. And this is a plot by the white community. Now, why would any student believe that? I mean, people have to think. So those kind, whenever somebody says those things, somebody else must speak up and tell the truth. We get along very well. I mean, you know, I'll never forget when Clemson was integrated, a reporter for a national, I won't mention his name, came down here to see what was happening. And Clemson integrated, there were maybe a few people carrying placards. And I happened to sit next to him in a restaurant, and he started to talk to me, and he said, well, there's nothing for me to do here. And I said, well, you took pictures only of those handful that were carrying the placards. He says, well, you got to do something.
Is there anything else that you'd just like to add, or anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I think we all need to examine ourselves. I think I've said enough about that. I want to say this about freedom. Freedom is not free. Freedom is not given. Freedom is earned, and you have to work at it. The rest of the world is changing. To me, it is remarkable what has happened without hardly any bloodshed in Russia or Eastern Europe. It's absolutely remarkable. But the people in Russia still think that because they say, today I want democracy and I have freedom, that the next day they're going to find gold in the streets. You have to work at it. And it comes with pain. It's almost like you don't give birth to a child. There's nothing more wonderful than to give life. But even that you do with pain. And people have to understand that. In our own country, people have to understand that freedom, you have to deserve it. It's not something that you own. You don't own it. And it's an ongoing thing. All in all, I am very optimistic about the future, despite all of America, beside all of these problems we have, because somehow we always respond. We always respond, and we will again. And of course, you are a professor and you work with young people. They are the ones. They are the ones that are going to have to carry the banner. You know, it's like a relay race. I hand it to a young person, and you hand it to another person. And it's got to go on like that. So,
thank you very much, Mr. Heller. Appreciate it.
thank you.
Okay.